Welcome to Zooming In at the UnPopulist. I'm Andy Craig. Populism is one of those words that gets used constantly, but it's rarely pinned down. Everyone agrees we're living in a populist era, but almost no one agrees on what that means or how you'd measure it. For the past 2 years, ISMA, the Institute for the Study of Modern Authoritarianism, our publisher here at the UnPopulist, has been trying to do exactly that. A national survey built around specific, testable definitions of populist attitudes, first fielded on the eve of the 2024 election, and now repeated in June of 2026. The second round results just came back, and the headline finding is a bit of a surprise. Trump's hardcore populist base has shrunk by about a third. To walk through what the survey found and what it tells us, I'm joined by the man who designed and ran it, Tom Shull, editor-at-large of the UnPopulist and ISMA's director of survey research. Tom, to start with, I want to dig into kind of how this survey is unique and what we were looking at with our definition of populism here, because people use that word kind of loosely. You know, we talk about populist politicians and populist attitudes in a broad sense, but this was really digging in on trying to have a consistent definition for how we can measure really the core of illiberal or broadly speaking populism. So what definition did we use and what did we find out of that?
Yeah, our definition in this area of academic research on populism is hotly contested. All right. So, in fact, I think our model, which is kind of an abstraction of various summaries of that literature, probably would find people pointing in the academic community, pointing at parts of it and saying, well, that's not necessary, and pointing at other parts and going, well, but this is good. So my hope is that, by and large, anyone who's studying that field would look at these things, maybe find some degree of agreement or disagreement, but they would understand and recognize these all as being within the realm of populist attitudes that are typically discussed. And essentially, we look at four. The first of those is feeling some sort of unusually strong personal attachment to the candidate, the leader of the party, the candidate for president, and his agenda. The second is essentially a feeling of anti-elite sentiment, typically towards government elites. It can be others, such as business elites, cultural elites, and so on. Another is a sense of perceiving or having some sense of antipathy towards a social group, something that we call a social outgroup. And this means that you have basically three things: a kind of negative feeling towards that group generally, a sense that they are somehow advantaged by government elites within society, and that finally they also are not really able to be true members of the national community. The fourth of those is an attachment to the leader of the party or the presidential candidate that is strong enough that they're willing to see that person exceed the legal limits on their presidential authority, their executive authority, in order to accomplish their goals, the movement's goals. So there's kind of a concern for liberal norms that's built into our fourth attitude. And basically, what we do is test for those attitudes in the survey and then say that anyone who has at least three of them would count as being part of a populist coalition.
And so compared to, this is the second time we've run this survey with that metric. And compared to last time, your top finding was that among Trump 2024 voters, so last time was shortly before the election, this time we're looking back at people who say they voted for Trump, that measure of populism has declined as a relative share. It was about a third, and now it's about a quarter of Trump voters. What do you think is driving that decline? And within those different metrics you're looking at, what's moved the most?
Yeah, essentially, you're right. What we did was look at the the people who in August of 2024, in the run-up to the election, said that they were going to vote for Donald Trump, at that time we measured populism along the lines of what I just described. And when we looked at the percentage of populists that we found amongst those who said they would vote for him, it was about 36%. Now, we went back into the field very recently. We were in the field from June 22nd to June 29th, had a nationwide survey, 1,000 respondents, and we asked people who they had voted for in 2024. And those who said they voted for Donald Trump were also then assessed on these various populist attitudes. And this time we found that only 25% actually registered as populist by our methodology. So this decline in the percentage of Donald Trump's 2024 voter support was from 36% to 25%, as you say, almost a third. And, essentially we saw declines in 3 of the 4 areas that we measure. Okay, there was some decline in terms of personal attachment to the president and or his agenda. And that decline was on the order of 22% in August 2024, down to about 17%, a little over 4 percentage points in decline there. Then we also saw a decline in the social outgroup area, right? That percentage of people who had chosen a social outgroup of some kind and said that, yes, they had those 3 attitudes: negative feeling, a sense that they were advantaged by government elites, a sense that they couldn't be true members of the national community, that also had declined somewhat from about 54% down to 49%. So a decline kind of the size that we saw amongst the question personal attachment. But the biggest decline came in that 4th final attitude, and that was sort of a willingness to see President Trump using his power outside bounds of the law in order to accomplish his goals. And we measured that in a couple of ways, but we saw drops in both of those questions that we asked, and it amounted to the largest decrease that we saw, which was from 63% approval in August 2024, all the way down to 48% approval in June of 2026. So you actually went from a strong majority to less than a majority, and that was a surprise. The other thing that I would say is that we divided all the data up from August 2024 in June 2026 and did our very best to dissect just exactly which of the declines, whether it was in personal attachment, whether it was in social outgroups, or whether it was this issue of less support for his use of extra-legal authority, which of them really had the biggest impact. And it's impossible to tell in a sense because you've got 2 different groups of people. It's not the same set of voters taking the survey, right? But as a practical matter, it looked pretty darn clear that what happened is a number of people that we qualified as populists dropped out of the populist category. We saw in particular because of that last attitude, that willingness to support the president in the use of extra-legal authority. So yes, all of those declines that we saw in the populist attitudes affected the number of populists that we saw and categorized as populists, but as a practical matter, probably the biggest effect came from this question of support for use of executive authority outside the bounds of the Constitution or law.
And that kind of has some illuminates part of what we've been seeing in the news, because of course, Trump came in at the start of 2025, and there was a big spree of a lot of things that we would say are abuse of power, that were really pushing hard against in many cases, flat out breaking the legal limits on the presidency and executive power. And since then, there's been a lot of tracking of his approval ratings that have declined. So in some sense, his overall support has declined. But what this really highlights is that within his support base, such as it is, there's been a decline in exactly that, in that degree of support for, yeah, my guy can bend the rules or break the rules. And I think part of that is maybe people are learning the lesson that they kind of got what they wished for and didn't like it as much as they thought, or at least that the ways Trump has been doing it in practice, with things like, launching the Iran war or the controversies over immigration enforcement, as we've seen that. And there was a bit of people recoiling from it, even among people who had voted for Trump, who are, generally speaking, Republicans or Republican leaners.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. We do see that decline amongst Trump supporters. It is perhaps not shocking in one sense. Obviously, many of those decisions have not polled that well. So when the question comes up, would you expect a decline in that support for his use of extra legal authority or bending the rules, as you put it, and in this case, sometimes breaking them? It is not a shock that we see some decline overall amongst Trump supporters. I think what is particularly interesting here is that the Trump populists are folks who, in a variety of ways, are particularly attached to that movement. They're attached to his political mission, and that attachment tends to weather pretty well if you've got some storms. But what we see amongst those people with that stronger attachment is that even they have shifted their attitudes towards some things that were in the past part of their kind of agreed set of attitudes towards Donald Trump and his presidency. When you go back to 2015, 2016, and you see the rise of what appears to be this kind of stronger populist sentiment amongst Americans, there was, I think, a strong feeling by 2024 that it was just an enduring part of the political landscape in the United States, because here Donald Trump had done something that was very, very unlikely. He got 3 nominations to run for president from the same party, and he won 2 of those elections. And it just seemed like it's deeply embedded. And, honestly, I would tend to agree that there is probably going to be persistent populist sentiment moving forward. I wouldn't dispute that. What I think I would dispute, and what I think the numbers here show, is that it isn't completely immune. It is not ever an ever-fixed mark, right? It is something that can be changed by circumstances, and as you say, experience, watching what happens, because ultimately, if you want certain political results, if you're looking to achieve certain political goals, and you see decisions that aren't leading you in that direction that you'd originally hoped for, it's quite possible and quite likely that you will start to change your mind, even if you have a strong loyalty to that project.
So on the other side of the aisle, we're in the middle of the primary season for the midterms upcoming, and there's been a lot of drama on the Democratic side, factional fighting between the more left wing and the more centrist wing of the party, lots of high-profile primary fights. But one thing that I thought was interesting, we saw all this movement among Trump voters on the populism score, but among Harris voters, among Democrats, which is broadly the whole left of center chunk of the survey, it was flat. It was 15% before the election, and it's about 15% now. And does that tell us something that when we speak of it, people will often kind of conflate that. The more progressive wing of it, all the way out to the Democratic Socialist kind of type candidates, are more populist. But does this tell us something that maybe that's a bit orthogonal to this question, that those ideological splits don't necessarily map onto our definition of populism?
I would think that, yes. So I would agree. I don't know that these things are a dead match. Now, I would suspect, without knowing for sure, especially because we have yet to do some important data cuts there, I believe that there will be some overlap. And part of the reason I say that is, when you look at Trump populists, as we have, and compared it to the number of people who say that they are very conservative, okay, which is what you do hear from a lot of strong Trump supporters. I'm a real conservative. I'm very conservative. Or if you say, do you consider yourself a MAGA Republican? There is overlap, but it is, on the order of 40, 60%. And so while it's a statistically significant connection, you're not going to deny that there's some strong overlap. You do see definite differences, and those differences are distinct enough that we feel that looking at this question of populism per se through the lens that we've used actually does add to your understanding of what you're seeing. So if I had to project, and we did not ask people, for instance, whether they were members of Democratic Socialists of America, but obviously moving forward, we would be doing that. And I think that we probably would see a correlation, but not a one-to-one mapping by any means.
So one interesting finding was that zeroing in on that antipathy to outgroups prong of our populism filter, there was an overall decline in that. And to be clear, you asked about a whole wide range of groups, all the different religious minorities, lots of different groups you asked about. But there was a noted increase among Trump populists for antipathy to Muslims and to transgender people. And obviously those are two things that to a degree have been in the news. Does this show that the party's messaging, Trump's own messaging, still has some ability to move his base on these things?
Yes, I think it does. It's difficult in a sense because we did not know in advance exactly what groups might show an increase, what groups might show a decrease, and did not sort of ask follow-on questions. What was it that drove this change in your views? But there is no doubt that when you look, for instance, specifically at Trump populists, they do follow the news carefully. They're more inclined to vote. They have strong views. All of these things suggest that they're paying close attention. And it's no doubt true of the sort of non-populist contingent as well, that supports Donald Trump. But, obviously there are differences between those two groups that are really quite pronounced in on a number of important questions that we ask. So do I think that part of this is sort of the emphasis the administration has put on, say, enforcement of immigration laws and questions about, the possibility of Muslim terrorism and things of this nature? Yeah, I would say that no doubt had an impact. There's obviously a growing resentment on the question of transgender athletes, and that may well have increased even entirely absent from actions taken by the Trump administration.
And one thing you mentioned there that I think is worth touching on, some people might say this is the populist era. We hear that all the time about, we're living in a time of rising and a very influential populism. But the actual, by our filter here, there's still a minority. Most people are not populist in this sense. They are not, animus against outgroups, supporting abuse of power, having this parasocial relationship with their leader. But one thing about them is that they are higher engaged. They are relatively more informed. We saw pretty consistently that they were less likely to say they don't know about various questions, that they have no opinion on, for example, when we looked at the piece I just wrote about electoral reform and the party system, they were pretty consistently higher to have an opinion in both directions on those questions because there were fewer in the middle answering unsure. But also on propensity to vote. I thought this was really dramatic. So among Trump populists, you found 88% plan to vote in the midterms and 83% of Harris populists. But it's only versus 50% of other voters, which is around what we see typically for midterm turnout. It's usually around 50%, give or take. So do we see that populists, because of their higher engagement and because they're, in that sense, more opinionated or more informed, depending on which gloss you want to put on it, that they kind of punch above their weight in terms of political impact?
Yeah, that certainly was my conclusion after just our August 2024 survey. You saw that they were more, as I mentioned earlier, they were more inclined to say that they were going to vote. They were more inclined to say, and they expressed that more strongly too. They also were more inclined to follow the news. If you tested them for their political views on various issues, you saw that they took the more absolutist position in general, or at least came closer to it than other voters. Now, there's a huge debate now about whether or not that truly affects your propensity to vote and whether or not you therefore dominate the primary elections. I would grant that it is not settled. In the midst of this, I think that your average political practitioner who looks at survey research would look at those groups that we've deemed as populists and say, well, those guys, they're probably going to the polls, and either that's bad for me or that's good for me, but that would be their strong instinct. These are folks who are going to the polls. And in this most recent survey, we asked not just, will you probably vote? Are you likely to vote? We just said, definitely vote as one of the possibilities. I will definitely vote. And this was because we know that people will say they'll probably vote and then they don't vote. But definitely vote is kind of upping the ante. And those percentages that you just gave out, about 88% of Trump populists, 83% of Harris populists, and 50% of everybody else, that was on the question of I will definitely vote. And, that willingness to say definitely vote is a pretty good indicator. So, I would say that they do punch above their weight. I think they do tend to have an outsized influence. And, all of that can be independent of the ballot box because obviously there's a kind of social atmosphere, a political atmosphere that's generated, especially in an era of social media, by the people who are most involved in politics. These are the things that they're most likely to talk about. If they're on TV, they're going to bring it up. If they're in social media, they're going to share that particular post. They drive the conversation independent in many ways of the actual ballot box. But I think, you're also looking at them punching above their weight at the ballot.
So one of the things that we've seen from Trump and his behavior is it's kind of come and gone in waves, but recently he's revisiting it more and more and telling his jokes that aren't jokes about running in 2028, about breaking the term limits and trying to seek a third term. And one of the results that I thought was most confirmed that we're on to something real with this measure of populism is that there was a huge split here among Trump populists versus Trump voters who were not populists. Among those we rate as populist, 51% say that they approve of Trump potentially running for a third term, and only 29% said they disapprove. So that's, it's not an overwhelming supermajority, but it's a pretty big, healthy chunk of those voters saying that they do approve of this pretty radical, crazy idea that he keeps floating. But among Trump populists, it was pretty much reversed. 57% of the non-populists who voted for Trump last time said that they disapprove of the idea of seeking a third term, and only about a quarter, 26%, said they approve. So I think that's a pretty strong indication that this filter we're using that you came up with and that is unique in the literature for trying to measure populism is getting at real divides that do track onto other issues. And we also saw that when you're looking at asking people their 2028 presidential choice other than Trump running again, because the Trump populists are a lot keener on Vance. I mean, Vance came out ahead in all of them, and Rubio in second, but we saw Vance do quite a bit better with populists and with people who had the strong personal attachment to Trump in particular among the populist prongs. So does that feel like a little bit of a vindication that this is not noise?
Yeah, I think even just with the August 2024 survey, there were places where the splits and the things that we were seeing were so in line, I guess, with what one might expect, with the occasional surprise that also, on reflection, was quite plausible. Kind of felt like we were already there in August of 2024, but I will grant that you don't know. Maybe that was simply the luck of contingent circumstances at the time, and having this survey come out and seeing the kinds of splits that we did was, something that did lead us to feel that we had something that was giving us a different sort of leverage on, what was going on, how the attitudes were being determined, what you might be able to predict. So, as you say, you have kind of a 51 to 29 favorability rating from Trump populists on the idea of his running for a third term. And then if you look at his non-populist supporters, and you remember these non-populist supporters now are 75% amongst the people who voted for him. So they're a very large, arguably a supermajority of 75%. They're against this. 57% of them disapprove. Only 26% approve. And, if you go outside of that, of course, if you're looking at non-Trump voters, now you're up in the 70s. Looking here, 79% of them are opposed to this. So if there's going to be a drive for a third term, it's going to take a lot of work to get there because the public support really isn't there. And, you see the same thing, by the way, in the question of satisfaction, right? Most surveys start, and ours right near the beginning asks the question, do you find yourself generally satisfied or dissatisfied with what's going on in the country right now? And if you look, 74% of the Trump populists are satisfied, but they are a complete outlier, right? You go to Trump non-populists who, despite their partisan attachment to the Republicans and to Donald Trump, they are split on this question. 42% dissatisfied, 40% satisfied, right? So they're actually leaning dissatisfied when their party is dominating Congress and is in the presidency. And then when you get down to the question of dissatisfaction elsewhere amongst non-Trump supporters, non-Trump voters, I should say, it's 76% dissatisfaction. So once again, you see that the Trump populists are definite outliers. And by the way, I will throw one more in on that, Andy. The question of January 6th, okay? We asked a question about whether or not you approved or disapproved of the actions of the people who entered the Capitol during the counting of votes January 6th, whether you approved or disapproved of that. And we asked that in August 2024. We asked it again in the most recent survey in June. And what we found is that essentially we got about the same level of support, which was very little. And if anything, it had gone down just a little bit. And I thought that was fascinating simply because there's been a hard push in the Trump administration to look at that group of people and say they were mistreated. They were not treated well. And I would say if I were, in the Trump strategic group or the Trump White House looking at the survey numbers, I'd be a little frustrated because for all of that argument that these people were mistreated and that they were misunderstood, you just don't see movement in support. If anything, it kind of tailed off just a bit. And the only people that we're finding who are saying that they're in favor of that, and it's just a plurality, are the Trump populists. The Trump populists are running about 36% approval, 28% disapproval. And when you get outside that, it completely reverses. Trump non-populists, they're at about 20% approval, 47% disapproval. And then by the time you get out to non-Trump populists, it's like 9% approval, 64% disapproval. And that disapproval is very high in the sense that people are saying they strongly disapprove, not just that they somewhat disapprove. And, for the people who aren't accounted for, they're just saying they don't have an opinion. There's not support there, except amongst the Trump populace.
So, as we touched on a little bit, this is kind of the first slice of findings, but this was a very large project. This is not a normal horse race poll. There's, I can speak to, and you've, of course, worked heavily on. There are dozens of questions, and we're going to be continuing to roll some of these findings out at the Unpopulist. So I just wanted to ask you kind of what more do we have to look forward to? What are some questions you still want to dig in on more?
Well, some of that's going to depend a little on what we find. Do I see some areas that I find interesting? Yes, I do. You stole one of them, Andy. You looked at the question of exactly what kinds of electoral reforms might find favor amongst the voting public. And I thought did a real nice job of treating that question, whether it was, a proportional representation, ranked choice voting, top two, etc. So for folks who have not looked at the Unpopulist essay on that by Andy Craig, I would absolutely encourage you to do that. I think for me, some of the things that I'm very interested in, one will be to look at the question of populists amongst the 2024 Harris voters. We never saw and still do not see a strong personal attachment to her. So an awful lot of what we are seeing in populist attitudes have more to do with anti-elite sentiment, which did go up, perhaps not surprisingly, in the past 2 years. Has actually gone up a bit. And that support for extra legal uses of power from an executive, even if it is Kamala Harris, which is how we pitched it. What if it were Kamala Harris? Are you comfortable with this? That declined, and that followed the pattern that we expected. We expect that when there is a Republican in power, particularly the one that defeated Kamala Harris, there are going to be a lot of folks who might otherwise support it who are just looking at the results and saying, yeah, maybe I'm not in favor of that after all. So we will look at that question, see if there might be potential, if there were different kinds of leaders involved that evoked more passion, if there's a possible increase lying ahead. One of the things that we do try to do is provide an early warning detector in this survey of when populism might take off. But aside from that, obviously we saw some important shifts in the demographics of the Trump base. There were increases in minority voting for him amongst Hispanics, amongst blacks. I'd like to look at that within the context of our model and see where that comes out. There are obviously other, straightforward questions that we haven't touched on here in this interview or in terms of the essays so far, and some of those have to do with attitudes towards America. I mean, here we were just before the 250th birthday of the nation, and so we ask questions about your pride in being American, question of whether Americans are freer now than they once were, and question of whether we've made moral progress or not. And I think all of those, from what I have seen so far, could produce some very interesting work and essays. So.
Well, excellent. So, Tom, thank you very much for all the work you've done on this. This is really, I want to emphasize to people, a massive undertaking, and ISMA has provided, I think, something that's a genuine contribution here to understanding populism, because one of the things, there's like you touched on, there's a lot of definitions out there floating around about populism, but it's been really difficult to disentangle from, are you actually measuring populism, or are you just measuring something that's coded in a way that it captures more of the right? And I think this really shows that you can get at something that, even though there is more of it on the right, we found, that does track that there are some populists on the left, and that the share of populists on the right can move independent of other variables. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing as we roll out more of this, and then hopefully here at some point down the road, we'll have another cycle of this. So Tom, thanks for joining us, and I encourage everyone to stay tuned at the UnPopulist for more of our populism survey results.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. I appreciate the chance to talk about it.
Thank you for listening to Zooming In, a project of the UnPopulist. To get all of the updates from our new series, Executive Watch, make sure to subscribe for free at theunpopulist.net. Until next time.